Hi, my name is Anna Kaminska, and today I'm going to be talking to you about culture and safety and how can we assess it. I come from the University of Aberdeen and I'm part of the Applied Psychology and Human Factors group within the School of Psychology there. And my research is supervised by Dr. Amy Irvin, Dr. Devin Ray, and Professor Rona Flynn. So let's get started. Some previous research in the field defines culture as the shared norms, values, and practices associated with either a nation, an organization, or a profession. And it has been shown that culture is a key input factor that influences the processes required for mission accomplishment. And these input factors, of which culture is one, determine the outcomes such as team performance and mission success and the safety of the performance, which then in turn also obviously influences various individual and organizational outcomes, revenue, all the things like that. However, most of the research in the field is decades old, which is a clear limitation because as the world becomes much more globalized and the culture becomes much more malleable, it's important to re-examine these issues. And there is some new and more recent exciting work coming out of the Reader and colleagues lab on national and organizational culture, specifically safety culture. Professional culture really has been rarely mentioned and quite overlooked within the field, which is something that we actually look at in more detail in our research. So what I specifically do is I examine how culture affects safety behaviors in helicopter pilots. And early on in the research, it really became apparent that there's a difference in professional culture of civilian trained and military trained pilots. And in our interviews and surveys that we have done, professional culture differences have really been highlighted. And pilots often speak about this difference in attitudes to flying between military trained and civilian trained pilots. And they often conceptualize it as the getting the job done attitude of the military trained pilots and really the safety above all attitude of civilian pilots. And really, this is quite an interesting finding because we're looking at commercial pilots for whom, for everybody, safety should be the most important thing. But again and again, this is a difference that really comes up. However, I think you'd agree that our research is not without its limitations. Obviously, surveys and interviews are self-report measures first and foremost, and they suffer from the limitation of only really assessing the perceptions and attitudes and not actual actions. So our pilots might be saying one thing and discussing certain aspects of their job, but it doesn't mean that actually the behaviors are like that. And that can be due to a couple of biases. So things like social desirability bias, so highlighting how safety is the most important thing for civilian pilots, for example, and also recall bias, which can relate to the fact that some pilots perhaps remember the more salient examples and then extrapolate that to the rest of the group. So kind of to try to bypass this, we really became quite interested in the Implicit Association Test. In its essence, it assesses feelings that an individual may be unaware of or does not wish to divulge, which is really helpful for us because it bypasses the problems of the self-report measures. In its essence, the IAT really is a sorting task, and it measures the implicit associations between two target concepts. So in a lot of research, it's flowers and insects and things like that the pictures see the pictures of, and two attributes, pleasant, unpleasant, that show up as words, and people just have to sort them with their hands. If you want to know a bit more about the methodology, there's some references in our conference paper. And the IAT has really been shown to be reliable and valid measure in various implicit attitudes and associations, including things like stereotyping, prejudice, anxiety, and things like that. So it's really quite commonly used type of measure and type of methodology. And IAT has also been used to predict at-risk behavior, which is something that we are quite interested in. So Hatfield and colleagues looked at attitudes towards speeding and behavior, and in Australian drivers, and they found that participants who held more strongly negative attitudes were less likely to exceed speed limits, and also were slightly more likely to drive slowly and slower than other participants. And also, more specifically, it has also been used in aviation industry, in general aviation. So Pauly and colleagues found that there's a relationship between general aviation pilots' implicit perceptions and previous involvement in hazardous aeronautical events. So the more weather-related hazardous events the pilot had been involved in, the less they associated implicit risk with adverse weather, and the less implicitly anxious they were towards adverse weather. And the results really support this hypothesis that pilots who implicitly see less risk and feel less anxious about bad weather and flying in bad weather are more likely to experience a greater number of hazardous aeronautical events than those pilots who are more afraid of adverse weather and perceive more risk associated with it. And this really shows that there is potentially a link between the risk perception that is somewhat measured in this implicit association test and actual risk-taking behaviors. So what we'd like to do is apply it to our research with helicopter pilots. And what we are thinking that we might expect to see, we haven't finished doing this research yet, is that helicopter pilots in general are unlikely to exhibit risk-taking behaviors, especially our sample, because our sample of helicopter pilots really are those offshore transport pilots or safe search and rescue pilots for whom safety really is extremely important. Thus, an implicit attitude test might actually help us to show a difference if there is one, because it really is a sorting task with split-second decisions. And hopefully, if there is a difference, then that's going to be able to highlight it. And we predict that military-trained pilots might exhibit a weaker implicit association between adverse weather and risk than civilian-trained pilots, due to the fact that in our previous research, they have been reported to be a lot more risk-taking than civilian-trained pilots. And there's also some research examining that these implicit associations often arise from early experiences. So if helicopter pilots are trained within the military, where really they are trained for the worst case scenario, which is war, and they need to take a lot of risks, then this implicit association test is what might actually help us see whether there is a difference or not. Thank you so much for coming to my talk and your attention. My research has been funded by the UKRI and CHC. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, feel free to email me on my email displayed here. And I'm always happy to chat. Thank you so much. Hope you have a lovely day. Bye.